Good day again, guys. Everything on the sun here. I'm starting to get back to business here with the updates. I'm looking at RaptureReady.com, which is a kind of a consolidation site for a lot of prophetically significant news, and I just see a lot of earthquakes happening, and we're going to talk about the first one here. Earth's tides can trigger earthquakes along San Andreas. But look at all the other earthquakes. Moderate 5.1 in Mexico. Earthquake shakes Anza. 4.1 magnitude in Hollister. Tokyo jolted by third earthquake in 4 days. And there's just a lot of earthquake news happening here. And I just see those as headlines just when I'm looking at it. So lots of shaking. The foundations of the earth are shaking. And the earth is groaning. And the Bible says that's going to happen in the last days. So we're going to see a lot more earthquakes. And I think this is an interesting article about earthquakes in the San Andreas Fault. Earth's tides can trigger earthquakes along San Andreas Fault. This is from livescience.com, and I'll have the link in the description, of course. The same tides that affect ocean waves can trigger earthquakes along California's San Andreas Fault. So now the tides and the waves are causing oscillations that could trigger an earthquake on the San Andreas, they're finding. Scientists unexpectedly find that these quakes are more likely to happen as tides are strengthening, not when they are at their strongest. The rise and fall of the seas. Tides are caused primarily by the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun on Earth. These gravitational tugs not only influence the seas but also stone, alternatively stretching and compressing Earth's crusts. So the tides just squish and relax the ocean. The crust of the Earth. Previous research found that the tidal effects on Earth crust could trigger both tremors and earthquakes. So now there's another cause and potential trigger for massive earthquakes. When the shaking occurs, it can reveal details about the deep roots of faults, which in turn could enrich models that might illuminate when earthquakes will happen. So I think in the general scheme of things, the tides actually act to get ready and exacerbate earthquakes. And when I see biblically when mountains fall into the ocean, like the Bible references, when a great mountain falls into the sea, I think in Revelation, you can see how that could trigger a global earthquake, because that's, if you're thinking of tides, that is obviously a massive tidal surge, and that could trigger some massive earthquakes. So interesting things when you look at all the events that could really push us into the end times prophetic scenario, and that could trigger these things that we may not have thought about. And a mountain falling into the sea could certainly trigger a cascade of events such as this. And not just the San Andreas, that could trigger all the other faults around the world, around the Ring of Fire as an example, to trigger and let go, basically. If you had a big enough tsunami or something on the North American west coast. The studies scientists were interested in how the planet's tides might affect small, deep seismic events known as low-frequency earthquakes. They focused on 81,000 cataloged low-frequency earthquakes that struck along California's San Andreas Fault between 08 and 15. These quakes are no larger than magnitude 1 on the Richter scale. We looked at a part of the fault that's weak, and so responds to tiny forces exerted by tides. Tidal strength varies over 2 week or fortnightly cycle. The strongest spring tides occur when the moon and sun are aligned, while the weakest neap tides happen when the sun and the moon are perpendicular to one another with respect to the earth. So interesting. I hope you're learning, because I'm learning from this. So interesting stuff scientifically about earthquakes and about the tide and the forces and when they're strong and weak. Specifically, these quakes were most likely to happen on days where tides were larger than previous days' tides by the greatest amount. That tells you something about how fast the fault is loaded. So it's loaded and unloaded, how long it takes for the fault to recharge before you can trigger these quakes, and how quickly this patch of fault is accumulating stress. So if there's no tides, if there were no tides, then these earthquakes, these fault zones would accumulate stress really quickly and never be relieved. So apparently the tide is actually helping to relieve the fault zones. That's interesting. The deep sections of the San Andreas that scientists investigated are separate from the shallow portions of the fault, most likely to produce major earthquakes. Everything we learn about the way faults work may ultimately contribute to better understanding. Again, it's prophetically significant because it could be a trigger event. What happened if tides stopped all of a sudden for some reason? Who knows why? That would build up the stress in the faults probably enormously, exponentially, because they seem to be releasing tension in the faults basically every day, twice a day as the tides come and go. But if you, for whatever reason, that stops, or if you have a big, massive tide, does that release a massive earthquake along the faults? Very interesting things, and things to look for, things to be, just put it in the back of your head and know that, that's something interesting could happen related to that. And just scientifically, that's interesting. So I hope that, educates you. It has me, and that's certainly interesting about earthquakes. And yeah, so when you read of the Revelation about the mountain being thrown into the sea, could that be an item that not just creates tsunamis, but actually triggers worldwide earthquakes as well? So something to think about, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.